by scratching the surface, you get a terrible shock. It's it's a heinous crime. People are so shocked by what...
The words were barely out before the atmosphere changed. Sophie had just been confirmed as the sole heir to Queen Elizabeth's private trust, and across the room, Camilla appeared frozen by what the decision meant. This was not simply about money, possessions, or another royal inheritance. It was about whom Elizabeth had chosen to protect, whom she had trusted privately, and whose hands she wanted controlling something deeply personal after her death. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not move. She read the final page once, then again, her eyes returning to the same line, as if repetition might somehow change it. The private trust, a personal legal arrangement holding assets outside the crown estate, which is the property and income structure tied to the monarchy rather than any one royal, named Sophie as sole heir and beneficiary. There was no shared authority, no secondary role, no quiet provision that brought the queen consort inside the arrangement. When she finally lowered the papers, she said nothing. Sophie felt the weight differently. The trusted confidant had expected responsibility, perhaps even a few personal keepsakes, but not this. Her shock carried sadness with it, because the inheritance did not feel like a reward. It felt like one final instruction from Elizabeth, delivered after death, and impossible to answer. She understood immediately why the decision mattered. This was not about public rank. It was about private confidence, the kind that could not be granted by marriage, ceremony, or title. The documents made that distinction even sharper. Elizabeth's trust contained personal letters, family keepsakes, private collections, and instructions describing how certain objects were to be preserved. These were not simply valuable possessions. They carried memory, intimacy, and the monarch's own judgment about who should protect them. Sophie's name appeared alone in the decisive language, and that detail cut deeper than any jewel or account ever could. Camilla's expression changed only slightly, but the silence around her became heavier. What unsettled her most was not merely being left without control. It was the precision of the exclusion. The wording did not look careless. It looked deliberate. Somewhere in Elizabeth's final planning, a choice had been made, and Sophie stood at the center of it. That left one question hanging over everyone who understood the history between them. Why had Elizabeth trusted Sophie so completely? And why had Camilla been left outside? Because beneath the legal language was something far more dangerous than an inheritance dispute. A judgment about trust that had been forming for years inside the royal family. Sophie and Camilla had occupied very different places inside Elizabeth's private world, and suddenly those differences mattered more than ever. One woman had spent years quietly building a reputation for reliability. The other had fought through decades of controversy to secure acceptance beside Charles. Now, a dead monarch's final private arrangement seemed to place those journeys side by side, and deliver a verdict neither woman could easily ignore. Sophie carried that weight quietly. Over the years, she had moved from being a younger royal spouse into someone Elizabeth could depend on during difficult family moments, public duties, and private responsibilities that demanded discretion. That mattered because working members of the royal family are expected to support the monarch through official engagements and charitable roles. But private confidence goes beyond duty. It is personal. It has to be earned. And the trusted confidant seemed to understand that distinction better than anyone. Camilla had taken a very different road. Her place beside Charles had been shaped by years of criticism, painful headlines, and the long struggle to gain public acceptance. She eventually stood beside him at the highest level of royal life. But the confirmation of Sophie's inheritance introduced a painful possibility. Public acceptance and private trust were never the same thing. The queen consort had earned position. Elizabeth, however, appeared to have reserved something more intimate for someone else. Sophie sat privately with Edward after the confirmation and admitted that the decision felt heavier than she expected. She did not speak like someone who had won. She spoke like someone who had suddenly inherited a responsibility she could not refuse. Edward listened as she explained that several personal items connected to Elizabeth's trust had been discussed with her long before the final documents were opened. Those conversations now felt different. What once seemed like ordinary family exchanges suddenly sounded like preparation. Camilla struggled with the same history from the opposite side. She had survived years when even being accepted inside royal life seemed uncertain, and she had stood beside Charles through enormous personal change. Yet none of that could erase the message sitting inside Elizabeth's final choice. The late monarch seemed to have drawn a quiet line between ceremonial acceptance, the public recognition of someone's place within royal life, and private confidence, which depended on personal judgment rather than rank. That distinction became impossible to ignore. Sophie remembered small conversations about family keepsakes, private letters, and objects Elizabeth wanted protected rather than displayed. She had never been told the entire plan, but the pattern now seemed deliberate. Camilla, meanwhile, was beginning to understand that this decision had not appeared suddenly after Elizabeth's death. Something had happened before. And when palace memories returned to that single moment, the mystery surrounding Elizabeth's decision suddenly began to look much less mysterious. Every royal rupture has a moment that seems ordinary, until history gives it meaning. In this story, that moment came during a private Windsor gathering, when Elizabeth discovered exactly who would respect one of her most personal wishes, and who would challenge it. No cameras captured what followed. No official statement recorded the disagreement. But those inside the family would later remember that evening as the point after which the Queen's private plans quietly began to change. Elizabeth had grown increasingly protective of the possessions she considered personal rather than ceremonial. Certain letters, keepsakes, photographs, and family pieces belonged to her private world, not automatically to the institutions surrounding the crown. That distinction mattered, because crown property is tied to the monarchy itself, while privately owned possessions can be directed according to an individual royal's wishes. Sophie had already become someone the monarch trusted, with quiet responsibilities, where discretion mattered more than public attention. The dinner changed everything. Camilla questioned why several deeply personal family pieces should remain outside future queen consort use, especially if they carried historical importance. Sophie answered calmly but firmly that Elizabeth had every right to decide their fate, without pressure from anyone else. The room went still. The trusted confidant had not raised her voice, yet the meaning was unmistakable. Rank did not give anyone automatic claim over what belonged personally to the Queen. Elizabeth did not respond with anger. She simply looked across the table, held the silence longer than anyone expected, and allowed the tension to settle. Later, after the others had gone, she thanked Sophie quietly for respecting her wishes. That brief exchange carried enormous weight, because the monarch was not thanking her for agreement alone. She was recognizing restraint, loyalty, and the willingness to defend a boundary without turning the moment into spectacle. Camilla left that evening deeply unsettled. In a private conversation with Charles afterward, she said Sophie had crossed a line by involving herself in something that should have remained between Elizabeth and the future royal household. He listened carefully, but he understood something she did not want to hear. His mother had not seen interference. She had seen protection. And that difference would matter far more than either of them realized. Elizabeth made one more move before the night ended. According to a fictional documented account prepared by a trusted advisor, she asked for the structure of her private trust to be reviewed and for the identity of the person empowered to protect it to be reconsidered. No dramatic declaration followed. No family meeting was called, but a decision had started taking shape. Years later, That Windsor dinner would return, with devastating clarity. What had once been an uncomfortable family memory was about to become an unavoidable confrontation. Camilla did not need another briefing. She wanted an answer from Sophie herself. When the two women finally stood face to face, years of careful royal politeness suddenly carried a different weight. The question was painfully simple. Had Sophie known what Elizabeth intended? Yet behind those 4 words sat resentment, grief, suspicion, and the humiliation of discovering that a private decision had been made long before anyone was prepared to discuss it openly. Camilla went straight to the point. "Did you know?" she asked, refusing to hide behind ceremony or carefully chosen palace language. Sophie paused before answering, because there was no harmless version of the truth. The trusted confidant said Elizabeth had spoken to her about responsibility, preservation, and the need to protect certain family things. But she had never been shown the complete trust arrangement. A private trust, in simple terms, is a legal structure that allows someone to place assets and instructions under controlled management for chosen beneficiaries. Neither woman could simply rewrite it now, which meant this confrontation was not really about procedure. It was about hurt. Sophie held her ground, but Camilla's composure began to fracture. She asked why Elizabeth would place that level of confidence in someone else when she had spent years building a life beside Charles and carrying the burden of becoming the king's wife. The queen consort was not asking about money anymore. She was asking whether everything she had endured had still failed to earn the late monarch's deepest trust. Sophie answered carefully. In a private conversation years earlier, she said, Elizabeth had told her that some family things needed a guardian who would never confuse possession with entitlement. The words landed hard. She explained that the queen had spoken about stewardship, not status, and about protecting what mattered, even when powerful people wanted access to it. Camilla knew immediately where that remark came from. Her mind returned to the Windsor dinner, to the disagreement over personal family pieces, and to Sophie defending Elizabeth's right to decide their fate without pressure. Suddenly, what had once seemed like an uncomfortable argument felt like something far more serious. The monarch had remembered. More than that, she had acted on it. The tension shifted. This was no longer simply a conflict between two women. Camilla now understood that if any influence remained, it would come through Charles. Sophie understood the same thing. The trusted confidant had the trust in her hands, but the king still stood between his late mother's wishes and his wife's pain. And when the king was forced to choose between protecting Camilla's feelings and honoring his mother's final arrangement, sentiment collided with duty. Charles had spent much of his life living beneath Elizabeth's authority, but now he faced an instruction she had left beyond his ability, or willingness, to disturb. Sitting with the trust papers before him, the king confronted a painful truth. Honoring his mother meant accepting a decision that wounded his wife. For once, royal power offered no easy escape. The question was not whether Charles could intervene. It was whether he believed he should. Charles read the decisive clause twice, then removed his glasses and set them beside the papers without speaking. Camilla watched him closely, waiting for some sign that he had found a way around the decision. But the wording was firm. Within this dramatized trust, Sophie held discretion, meaning she had the legal authority to manage the designated possessions according to Elizabeth's instructions, while explicit protections blocked other family members from overriding her choices. That mattered, because this was not simply about inheritance. It placed the king between his late mother's final wishes and his wife's sense of rejection. Camilla asked the question he had been avoiding. Could anything be changed? Charles did not answer immediately. He understood why she was hurt. She had spent years beside him, surviving public anger, family tension, and the long journey toward acceptance. Yet changing Elizabeth's arrangement now would turn personal pain into something larger. It would mean challenging a decision his mother had made deliberately, with safeguards designed to survive exactly this kind of pressure. Charles finally told her quietly that he would not do it. The monarch said altering the arrangement would cross a line he could not justify, because honoring Elizabeth meant respecting the choices she made when no one was watching. Camilla absorbed the answer in silence. Her husband had not chosen Sophie over her. He had chosen not to undo his mother's final act of control. The papers carried another sting. Elizabeth had added language requiring the sole heir to preserve certain possessions according to private instructions, making clear that some pieces were never meant to be absorbed into ordinary royal use. And with those papers came something even more personal. A sealed note addressed directly to Sophie. Its presence proved that this was not merely an administrative arrangement. The trusted confidant had been given emotional responsibility as well as legal control. Camilla understood the consequence before anyone needed to explain it. If Charles would not intervene, then the trust would stand exactly as Elizabeth intended. Sophie's authority was real, and the Queen Consort's expectations would now meet boundaries they had never faced before. The decision was no longer trapped inside paperwork. It was beginning to change what Camilla could touch, request, and expect. The fallout arrived without ceremony. There was no explosive announcement, no public stripping of rank, no dramatic palace declaration. Instead, Camilla encountered something colder. A request that once might have been treated as routine was politely refused. In that restrained response, the reality of Elizabeth's decision became unmistakable. Sophie now controlled the trust, and for the first time, Camilla understood that the inheritance carried practical authority as well as emotional meaning. Sophie began overseeing the cataloging of the trust-related possessions under Elizabeth's written instructions. Each piece had to be separated carefully from items tied to the wider royal institution, because these objects were treated as private family property rather than symbols automatically available to the reigning household. That distinction mattered. A private family possession could carry enormous historical meaning while still remaining outside normal royal use. The trusted confidant now had responsibility for deciding how those objects were preserved, stored, and eventually passed on. Camilla tested that new reality sooner than anyone expected. She requested temporary access to one personal Elizabeth-era piece for a commemorative occasion, assuming that such a limited use might be allowed. The reply was courteous, restrained, and final. Under the trust terms, the item could not be released for the purpose she had requested. The Queen Consort read the response slowly, searching for flexibility that was not there. Camilla removed her reading glasses and placed them beside the letter. For several moments, she said nothing. The refusal carried more weight than the object itself, because it confirmed something she had resisted accepting. Sophie's authority was not symbolic. Elizabeth had created boundaries that continued to operate even after her death, and Charles had already made clear that he would not interfere with them. Sophie discovered the reason when she reviewed the next set of instructions. Elizabeth had specifically identified several pieces as items that should never become accessories of position or rank. Another passage gave the heir discretion to judge their future according to family meaning rather than hierarchy. In plain terms, Sophie was being asked to protect emotional significance above status. That gave her remarkable freedom, but it also placed an enormous burden on every decision she made. Sophie did not celebrate. The trusted confidant understood exactly how the refusal would feel to Camilla, and she knew allowing resentment to grow would turn Elizabeth's wishes into a permanent family wound. Instead of hiding behind the paperwork, she made an unexpected decision. She asked Camilla to meet her privately. No aides, no advisors, no one to soften the words between them. What happened next would transform the story from a battle over inheritance into something neither woman had anticipated. There were no courtiers, no advisors, and no carefully prepared palace language, when Sophie finally sat opposite Camilla. Between them rested the sealed note Elizabeth had entrusted to her. Until that moment, the trust had felt like a dividing line, proof that one woman had been chosen and another excluded. But Sophie did something Camilla did not expect. She opened the letter, read the most personal instruction aloud, and turned Elizabeth's final judgment into something far more complicated than victory or defeat. Sophie had asked for the meeting because she refused to let the trust become another palace faction, with one side celebrating and the other nursing humiliation. The trusted confidant understood that Elizabeth's private instructions were not meant to create a winner. The letter described stewardship, the duty to protect and preserve something on another person's behalf, as a responsibility tied to family memory rather than status. That mattered because it changed the meaning of the inheritance completely. Sophie admitted something Camilla had not expected to hear. She said she never wanted the arrangement treated as proof that she had defeated anyone, least of all the queen consort. For her, the trust carried pressure, not triumph. Every item, every letter, every private instruction reminded her that Elizabeth had placed a burden in her hands and expected her to resist ambition. Camilla finally stopped defending herself. She admitted that the deepest wound had never been losing access to possessions. It was the fear that Elizabeth had died without fully trusting her. She had spent years surviving judgment, standing beside Charles, and proving she could endure the demands of royal life. To discover that another woman had been chosen for something so personal made all that acceptance feel suddenly incomplete. Sophie unfolded the note and read the line that changed everything. Elizabeth had instructed the heir to protect the collection without ambition, competition, or expectation of position. The words were stark, but they were not cruel. The trusted confidant then pointed out what mattered most. Camilla's name did not appear anywhere in the passage. Elizabeth had not written a condemnation. She had drawn a boundary around stewardship. Camilla absorbed the distinction slowly. The queen consort was still hurt, but the wound had changed shape. This was no longer a story about revenge from beyond the grave. It was about Elizabeth choosing a specific guardian for a specific responsibility. And just as that understanding began to soften the tension between them, the private matter broke beyond palace walls. Inside the room, tension had begun to soften. But outside palace walls, the revelation was exploding into something much louder. By morning, the private decision belonged to the public imagination. Elizabeth's choice of Sophie over Camilla was suddenly being interpreted as everything from a final vote of confidence to a devastating posthumous rebuke. Yet one image captured the mood better than the endless arguments. People gathering outside Windsor, staring at newspaper front pages carrying Sophie's face beside the words, "The Queen's Final Trust." What had begun privately was now being judged by an entire country. Sophie watched the coverage beside Edward and looked increasingly uncomfortable as commentators turned a private responsibility into a public contest. Broadcasters carefully explained that the trust was separate from institutional royal property, meaning it concerned Elizabeth's personal possessions and instructions rather than assets belonging automatically to the crown. That distinction mattered, because the story was not really about one woman gaining royal power. It was about whom the late monarch had trusted to protect something personal. Edward noticed the tension immediately. He reminded Sophie that she had not asked for the attention, but the trusted confidant knew that would not stop the headlines. Palace aides were already pushing back against the simplest version of the story, trying to prevent it from becoming a crude battle of Sophie versus Camilla. Yet once the public sensed rivalry, every detail became evidence. Camilla saw the same coverage and reacted far more quietly than she would have days earlier. The queen consort still felt the sting of being excluded, but Sophie's private reading of Elizabeth's letter had changed the meaning of that exclusion. She now understood that the arrangement was about stewardship, not punishment. Even so, Watching strangers debate whether Elizabeth had trusted another woman more deeply was painful in a way no private conversation could completely soften. Outside Windsor Castle, the public mood became impossible to ignore. Visitors clustered around a newspaper stand carrying the headline, "The Queen's Final Trust. Sophie alone inherits private legacy." Some read it as a declaration of loyalty. Others saw it as a final judgment on Camilla. One broadcaster cut through the noise by framing the decision not as a question of money, jewels, or status, but as Elizabeth's definition of dependable service, quiet responsibility without expectation of reward. Sophie heard those words and felt the burden deepen. Camilla heard them and understood the challenge more clearly. The country wanted a winner and a loser, but Elizabeth's instructions had never been written that way. Now both women had to decide whether the public story would divide them, or whether the private meaning of the trust would finally settle everything. And in the final reckoning, the most important inheritance would prove to be neither jewels nor possessions, but the burden attached to being trusted. In the end, Camilla had not lost a crown, and Sophie had not gained one. What changed was more personal. Elizabeth's private trust revealed the difference between public position and private confidence, leaving both women forced to confront what loyalty meant when titles could no longer answer the question. Sophie inherited responsibility. Camilla inherited an uncomfortable truth. And Charles was left to honor a decision made by a mother who had ensured that her final wishes could speak without him. Sophie accepted the arrangement without celebration. She remained the sole heir to Elizabeth's private trust, carrying responsibility for administering the possessions, letters, and instructions exactly as they had been left. That mattered because the trust was never designed as a public prize. It was a private structure built around preservation, meaning the trusted confidant was being asked to protect memory rather than display power. Charles made his position equally clear. The king accepted his mother's arrangement and told those closest to him that there would be no attempt to weaken, rewrite, or quietly undermine it. His decision closed the last possible route around Elizabeth's wishes. For Camilla, that finality could have felt like another rejection. Instead, it forced a different kind of acceptance. Sophie later told Edward in a private conversation that she felt no triumph at all. She described the inheritance as an obligation that would follow her for years, because every decision now carried Elizabeth's standards with it. The trusted confidant understood that being chosen was not the same as being favored. It meant being trusted to say no when necessary, to preserve what mattered, and to resist turning private history into personal advantage. Camilla finally reached the same conclusion from the other side. The Queen Consort recognized that Elizabeth's choice concerned a very specific kind of stewardship and did not erase the position she had built beside Charles. She did not challenge the arrangement again. The anger softened into something quieter, the recognition that some forms of confidence cannot be demanded through marriage, rank, or proximity to the throne. Sophie made that meaning permanent through her first decisive choice. She ordered the most personal pieces preserved, rather than used for ceremonial display or treated as objects of monetary value. In doing so, she fulfilled the responsibility Elizabeth had placed in her hands and proved why the trust had been structured so carefully. There would be no reversal, no final confrontation, and no second decision. Sophie kept Elizabeth's trust because Elizabeth had deliberately placed it in her hands, and Camilla's frozen reaction became the painful beginning of accepting that some royal legacies are inherited not through crowns, but through confidence earned quietly over time. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.